Okay, in this video clip, we want to trace Einstein's path to the so-called miracle year. Sometimes you'll see this in Latin, the annus mirabilis. It comes originally from 1600s, actually. Isaac Newton himself, in the about 1666, 1667, he was in London at Cambridge, and there's an outbreak of the plague. And so he retreated to his family's farm in the countryside to get away from that. During his time there, he not only really laid the foundations for his theory of gravity, he also came up with the calculus. And therefore, because of those astounding results of this really unknown person in his 20s, 20-year-old, but a little older than that, is called the miracle year, annus mirabilis, at least to science types. And then Einstein himself, 1905, so approximately 220, 230 years later, has his own miracle year. So we want to figure out how does he get to that miracle year and say a few words about the miracle year itself, why it was seemingly so miraculous. So here's a rough outline of where we're going, just some of the highlights here. We won't go into all the details because if you want, you of course can get those in the profile of the young Einstein, or maybe you've already read some of that. So this will just give you a pathway through that, reminder of some of those things. Youth in Munich. He was born in 1879, as we said in the previous video clip. His family moved to Munich when he was very young. As I mentioned in the other video clip, his father and uncle started essentially electrical business, electrotechnology business, in terms of developing especially electric lighting for various cities, townships in the Munich region. He went to school in the Munich school system, and one thing to know about the German school system at the time, very rigid, very hierarchical, and had a strong sort of militaristic Prussian slant to it. And Einstein rebelled against that very, very strongly. And throughout his life, he had that sort of anti-authoritarian streak in him, and it did not fit well with him. So much so that by the time he was 16, 17, he renounced his German citizenship. And his father let him do that. And for several years then, he actually was he was stateless. He wasn't a citizen of any place. He wanted to become a Swiss citizen, but that took several years in terms of the paperwork and fees involved and so on and so forth. So he eventually became a Swiss citizen, and then later in his life became a German citizen again when he became famous, and they wanted to claim him again, as it were. Mentioned last time also that he went to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich, Switzerland. He actually did not get in on his first try. He applied sort of a year early to essentially get away from the Munich school system, and wasn't successful the first time. He did well in the science and math aspects of the entrance exam, but not, I think, French in particular was one of his weak areas. And so the professor there, physics professor, liked what he saw in Einstein, but said, go away for a year and come back and then try again. And so that's essentially what Einstein did, although actually the professor said, I'll even tutor you for a year if you want. But his family chose a different school to go to for a year, a nearby school in close to Zurich. That professor was Herr Professor Weber, who was the primary physics professor. There were actually two physics professors at the Swiss Federal Polytechnic, but he was the one that interacted with Einstein the most. Einstein enjoyed his lectures, at least early on, but later on in the course of study felt that Weber was behind the times, especially in terms of his knowledge and teaching of electromagnetic theory, Maxwell's equations, and things like that. Einstein's sort of impertinent attitude, impudent attitude, even touch of arrogance at times came through, because he at times would address Professor Weber not as the proper Herr Professor Weber. German educational system was very hierarchical, as was German culture and society in many places. And instead he'd just say Herr Weber, which really bordered on an insult. It was not the type of thing you would be addressing your professors as. And so in fact Weber at one point said, Einstein, you're a very smart person, but no one can teach you anything. that type of thing. And so Einstein certainly had that touch of arrogance about him in his youth, and it got him into trouble at times. In fact, a little later on here, we'll see how it got him into trouble. Also, while at the Swiss Federal Polytechnic, he met Mileva Maric, put the last name in here too, who was a Serb and came to Switzerland for its universities. Actually, many women students from throughout Europe came to Switzerland because in their homelands they weren't allowed to go to university, and so you saw many of them in Swiss universities. It was unusual, though, for a woman to be studying physics, science, and math like Mileva was. She originally was going to study medicine, then switched to physics, and that's therefore how she and Albert met. They were essentially studying to be high school physics teachers. That was the whole idea of the Federal Polytechnic. They weren't being trained to be future professors or anything like that, but the idea was that, as we saw last time with the burgeoning electrotechnological industry, they needed trained workers. How do you get those? Well, you teach them in high schools and similar schools like that, technical schools, and therefore there was a need for teachers. And so both Mileva and Albert Einstein himself were training essentially to be those types of teachers. He graduated in 1900. His grades were okay, but not great. They sort of tailed off his last 2 years for whatever reason, maybe just because he got tired of going to lecture. In fact, we know he got tired of going to lecture. He relied on some friends' notes in many cases to pass his exams. In his mid-year exams or mid-course exams, 2 years in, he did very well. Again, his graduation exams he passed, but did not do as well as he'd done before. Mileva actually did not pass, which was obviously a big disappointment to her and to him to a certain extent. So the graduation in 1900, and then the idea, of course, got to get a job. In particular, he was hoping to get a job so he could marry Mileva, which caused a lot of tensions. I have career anxieties here. There are also a lot of family anxieties. His family did not care for Mileva for a number of reasons. She was Serbian, for one. Secondly, she was very short, not conventionally attractive, 5 feet, maybe less than 5 feet. She had a congenital defect in her hip, so she walked with a limp. So therefore, the question of her soundness as a wife came into play. His mother had another favorite among his earlier girlfriends, etc., etc. So there's a lot of family tension at this time, and of course, Einstein's own impertinent tendencies came into play as well. As far as his career anxieties here, what he was really wanting to do was get a position as a physics assistant, perhaps with Herr Professor Weber, helping him out in the physics labs in training of future engineers and things like that, or with another university. Unfortunately, probably because, or at least in part because, he had sort of antagonized Professor Weber, he couldn't get a position anyplace. He had the suspicion that Weber was sort of bad-mouthing him to his colleagues in various places. And even though he applied to essentially universities all over Europe, nothing came up. And in fact, there's a very poignant letter that, unknown to Einstein, unknown to Albert, his father wrote. He wrote a letter to a professor at the University of Leipzig. It was Professor Wilhelm Ostwald, a very well-known physics professor. And here's what his father, Hermann, wrote to Professor Ostwald. He said, "Please forgive a father who is so bold as to turn to you, esteemed Herr Professor, in the interest of his son. I can assure you that he is extraordinarily studious and diligent and clings with great love to his science. My son, therefore, feels profoundly unhappy with his present lack of position and his idea that he has gone off the tracks with his career and now is out of touch. This feeling gets more and more entrenched each day. In addition, he is oppressed by the thought that he is a burden on us, people of modest means. Since it is you, highly honored Herr Professor, whom my son seems to admire and esteem more than any other scholar currently active in physics, it is to you whom I have taken the liberty of turning with a humble request to read his paper published in the Null für Physik, and to write him, if possible, a few words of encouragement so that he might recover his joy in living and working. If in addition you could secure him an assistant's position for now or the next autumn, my gratitude would know no bounds. Again, Albert did not know his father had sent that, as far as we know. But you get some of the feeling coming through there. It's also, Hermann, his father, mentions being people of modest means. They actually had been fairly prosperous, but in the 1890s, their electrotechnology business hit some real bumps. They lost a key contract that they were vying for, and therefore went bankrupt in 1894, tried again, went bankrupt in 1896, and therefore it really weighed on Einstein, perhaps even more than his father, who was sort of more of an optimistic sort. So a lot of these things were weighing on Einstein at the time, the career anxieties, the family anxieties, the rift with his family in terms of his relationship with Mileva. No record exists of response by Professor Ostwald to Hermann Einstein's letter on behalf of Albert. What's ironic, however, is just a few years later, in fact 9 years later, this was written about 1901, 9 years later, Ostwald was the first person to nominate Einstein for a Nobel Prize. So he may not have even read the letter, who knows, he may have read it and just tossed it, but within 9 years, Einstein was definitely on Ostwald's mind. So definitely career anxieties at this point in time. He was looking for a position as a physics assistant, perhaps. He thought about tutoring, teaching position in a high school someplace. And a friend of his came through for him. After about a year of this, a friend in need, a friend named Marcel Grossman, who actually had helped him graduate, because this Marcel Grossman actually went to lectures and took notes that Einstein could then use. Einstein spent a lot of time tinkering around in the laboratories. He enjoyed that more than many of the lectures. Well, Marcel Grossman's father knew the head of the Swiss Patent Office. And again, the whole context here of this revolution in electrotechnology, and really, if you think about it, the last 20 or 30 years, there's an analogy with the computer industry in our time, providing a lot of opportunities. And in this case, the patent office needed to expand. They're getting more and more patents in electrical and technological fields, and so they were going to add a position. Einstein wasn't quite perfectly qualified for it, because the best training would be, say, a mechanical engineer, but his physics training allowed him to qualify, and he certainly knew electricity and magnetism very well, that part of it, and they felt they could train him. So essentially, that opportunity opened up, although it took a little while before he actually got the position there. So that was about 1901. In celebration of this, Einstein at that time was actually in Milan, Italy. His father had moved the business from Munich to Milan because investors in business thought that the Milan area would be a better area for developing a new business. They were selling generators and things like that by that time. So he invited Mileva, hey, let's go for a nice weekend together to celebrate. They met in northern Italy at Lake Como. Mileva was still in Switzerland at the time. She was studying for another year to try to graduate. They met there, had the great romantic weekend. They talked about, going on a boat up Lake Como and over the Splugen Pass on this sleigh with snowdrifts, on either side of them, and so on and so forth. So a lot of lasting memories that Mileva wrote about to a friend. A few months after that, another lasting memory came along because Mileva discovered she was pregnant. And as you might imagine, that added even more to the anxiety and turmoil that Albert and Mileva are feeling at this point. And so there's a lot of zigzagging at this point in terms of what Einstein felt he should do. Sometimes he would say, he'd write to Mileva and say, I will look for a position immediately, no matter how humble it might be. So he actually considered going into the insurance industry. He applied for a position teaching just physics in high school. He applied for another position teaching essentially mechanics and machines and so on and so forth. So he was just trying to find anything, because even though we mentioned his friend, Marcel Grossman, had an in the patent office, that position hadn't actually been advertised yet. There was a long delay here. And finally, though, all the zigzagging ended because the patent office position did open up. The head of the patent office actually wrote personally to Einstein and said, please apply for this position. And finally, it came through, and that would be in about 1902. So there's about a 2-year period from when he graduated to 1902 with turmoil, a lot of anxiety in his personal life and his professional life. He was able to continue to do some physics. And in fact, also in 1902, when he was then at the patent office in Bern, Switzerland, a couple of his friends and he put together what they called, sort of grandiose terms, the Olympia Academy. Essentially, they got together and they read books together, a lot of works in physics, but also philosophy, literature, and they would read and discuss these books intently and intensely for hours at a time, and also play some practical jokes on each other and things like that. So he certainly was still doing some physics. He'd actually been able to publish a few papers along the way, but he essentially was out of academics, and just anybody looking at him at that point would say, it's nice he has that secure position in the civil service, in the patent office, and maybe can keep doing a little physics on the side, as it were, and discuss it with his friends in this informal Olympia Academy they had. Mentioned the pregnancy back here. A daughter, Liesl, was born. We don't know actually the formal name given to her, and actually we don't know what happened to her. There have been, once this did not come to light until about the 1980s or so fairly recently. It was not known during Einstein's lifetime itself. And there's some evidence that she might have died at a fairly early age, maybe about 2 years old, of scarlet fever. But there's no definitive evidence exactly what happened to her. Some people think maybe, again, she was adopted by friends of Mileva's family. Whatever, what we do know is that Mileva joined Albert in Bern, Switzerland, when he got the job at the patent office, and Liesl was not with them at that point. And clearly, just reading between the lines in some of the accounts of Mileva's life, it affected her profoundly and had implications for their later lives as well. So finally, then, we come to the miracle year. Miracle year of 1905. Again, you would not look at Einstein's life here. Certainly, he was a good physics student. Look at his career so far, and this would be totally unexpected that this would happen. He had been able to publish a few physics papers in German journals, but nothing extraordinary. So let's just take a look at the miracle year itself here and talk about, briefly, the 5 papers that he published in the miracle year.